The year was 1974, and Muhammad Ali stood at the pinnacle of his boxing career. Fresh from his stunning victory over George Foreman in Zaire, the heavyweight champion had returned to America as more than just a boxer. He was a global icon, a symbol of resistance, and a man whose every move captivated the world. But on this particular autumn morning in Chicago, something would happen that would shake even the unshakable Muhammad Ali to his core. It started with a phone call to his training camp. Angelo Dundee, his longtime trainer, answered with his usual gruff voice, expecting another interview request or business proposition. Instead, he heard something that made him pause mid-sentence. A woman's voice, soft but determined, speaking with an accent he couldn't quite place. She claimed to have information about Ali's past that would change everything he thought he knew about himself. She wouldn't give her name, only that she was a white woman who had been searching for him for over 2 decades. Angelo hung up the phone, his weathered hands trembling slightly. In all his years in boxing, he had fielded thousands of calls from fans, reporters, and opportunists. But something about this woman's voice, the way she spoke Ali's birth name, Cassius Clay, with such familiarity, sent chills down his spine. He knew he had to tell Ali, but how do you tell a man that his entire understanding of his origins might be built on incomplete truths? Meanwhile, Ali was in the gym, his powerful frame moving with the fluid grace that had made him famous. Each punch against the heavy bag echoed through the space like thunder, sweat glistening on his dark skin as he prepared for his next fight. The rhythm of his training was almost meditative. Jab, cross, hook, the sound of leather against canvas, creating a symphony of dedication and discipline. When Angelo approached him between rounds, Ali immediately sensed something was different. His trainer's usual confident demeanor had been replaced by uncertainty, something Ali had rarely seen in the man who had guided him through the most challenging fights of his career. Angelo's eyes darted around the gym, making sure they were alone before he spoke in hushed tones about the mysterious call. Ali stopped mid-punch, his gloved hands dropping to his sides. The gym fell silent, except for the distant sound of traffic from the Chicago streets outside. For a moment, the man who had faced down the most fearsome opponents in the ring looked genuinely unsettled. He had always known there were gaps in his family history, questions his parents had deflected with uncomfortable silences whenever he pressed too hard. Growing up in Louisville, Kentucky, Ali had always felt different, not just because of his exceptional athletic abilities, but because of something deeper, something he couldn't quite articulate. His father, Cassius Clay Sr., was a sign painter with dreams bigger than his circumstances allowed. His mother, Odessa, was a domestic worker whose gentle nature contrasted sharply with her son's fiery personality. They loved him fiercely, but there had always been whispered conversations that stopped when he entered the room, documents that were quickly hidden when he showed curiosity about family photographs. The woman had left a number and an address, a small hotel in downtown Chicago where she was staying. She would wait exactly 3 days, she had told Angelo, and if Ali didn't come, she would disappear forever, taking her secrets with her. The urgency in her voice suggested this wasn't a game or publicity stunt. This was something that had been weighing on her conscience for years, something that demanded to be revealed. Ali spent the rest of that day in unusual silence, his typical playful banter with sparring partners replaced by deep contemplation. He shadowboxed with less intensity, his mind clearly elsewhere. The other fighters in the gym noticed the change immediately. Muhammad Ali was never quiet, never subdued. He was the man who proclaimed himself the greatest, who composed poetry about his opponents, who could light up a room with his charisma and wit. But today he seemed almost vulnerable, human in a way that reminded everyone that beneath the larger-than-life persona was a man with the same fears and uncertainties as anyone else. That evening, Ali sat in his hotel room overlooking Lake Michigan, the city lights reflecting off the dark water like scattered diamonds. He had converted to Islam years earlier, changing his name from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali, declaring his independence from what he called his slave name. The transformation had been more than religious. It was a complete reimagining of his identity, his purpose, his place in the world. Now, this mysterious woman threatened to upend everything he thought he knew about where he came from. He thought about his childhood in Louisville, the segregated South, where he had learned to fight, not just with his fists, but with his words and his will. The amateur boxing program that had discovered his talent when he was just 12 years old, angry about his stolen bicycle and determined to beat up whoever had taken it. The police officer who had redirected that anger into the boxing ring, unknowingly setting in motion a chain of events that would change sports history forever. But there had always been questions. Why did he look different from his siblings? Why did certain family friends treat him with a mixture of affection and something that looked almost like guilt? Why did his mother sometimes stare at him with tears in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking? These memories, long buried beneath years of training, fighting and fame, now surfaced with uncomfortable clarity. The next morning brought no relief from his internal turmoil. Ali's usual breakfast routine, oatmeal, fruit and endless cups of coffee, while reading multiple newspapers, was interrupted by his own restlessness. He paced his hotel room like a caged animal, his mind racing between curiosity and fear. What if this woman was telling the truth? What if everything he believed about his origins was incomplete, or worse, deliberately hidden from him? Angelo arrived early, bringing with him the weight of his own sleepless night. He had been with Ali through the most challenging periods of his career: the conversion to Islam, the name change, the refusal to serve in Vietnam that had cost him the best years of his boxing career. He had watched Ali transform from a brash young fighter named Cassius Clay into a global symbol of resistance and principle. But this felt different, more personal, more potentially devastating than any professional challenge they had faced together. They decided to drive to the hotel where the woman was staying. The journey through Chicago's busy streets was tense, filled with uncharacteristic silence. Ali stared out the window at the city he had conquered in the ring, but today it felt foreign, uncertain. Every block they traveled brought them closer to answers he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. The hotel was modest, the kind of place where traveling salesmen and families on tight budgets stayed when visiting the city. The lobby smelled of old carpet and industrial cleaning products, a far cry from the luxury accommodations Ali was accustomed to. The desk clerk, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, looked up with surprise when he recognized the heavyweight champion. But Ali's usual warmth and playful interaction with fans was absent. He simply asked for the room number, his voice steady, but lacking its typical musical quality. As they rode the elevator to the third floor, Ali's hands, those powerful instruments that had defeated the greatest fighters of his generation, trembled almost imperceptibly. Angelo noticed but said nothing, understanding that some moments require silence, that some fears can only be faced alone, even when you're not actually alone. The hallway was narrow and dimly lit, with worn carpet that muffled their footsteps. Room 307 was at the end of the corridor, and as they approached, they could hear the faint sound of a television playing inside. Ali raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. Once he knocked on that door, there would be no going back. Whatever truth lay behind it would become part of his story forever. He knocked 3 times, firm, but not aggressive. The television sound stopped immediately, followed by the soft sound of footsteps approaching the door. A voice, the same voice Angelo had heard on the phone, asked who it was. When Ali identified himself, there was a long pause, followed by the sound of multiple locks being undone. The door opened slowly, revealing a woman in her early 60s with silver-gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through him. She was well-dressed but not wealthy, with the kind of understated elegance that spoke of good breeding rather than money. But it was her expression that caught Ali off guard, a mixture of relief, sorrow, and something that looked almost like recognition, as if she was seeing someone she had known long ago. She invited them in without ceremony, her movements careful and deliberate. The hotel room was small but neat, with a single suitcase on the bed and a manila envelope on the small table by the window. She gestured for them to sit, but Ali remained standing, his athletic frame filling the small space with nervous energy. For several moments, nobody spoke. The woman studied Ali's face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, her blue eyes tracing his features as if she was memorizing them or comparing them to some internal image. Finally, she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of years of carefully guarded secrets. She told them her name was Margaret Sullivan, and she had been searching for Muhammad Ali for 23 years. Not Muhammad Ali, the boxer, not the heavyweight champion of the world, but the baby boy who had been born in a small clinic in Louisville, Kentucky, on January 17, 1942. The baby whose birth certificate contained information that had been carefully hidden from him his entire life. Ali felt the room spin slightly, his usual quick wit and verbal agility completely abandoned. He sat down heavily in the room's single chair, his eyes fixed on this woman who claimed to hold the keys to mysteries he had carried his entire life. Margaret Sullivan reached for the manila envelope with hands that shook slightly, her own emotional state clearly fragile despite her outward composure. Inside the envelope were documents, birth certificates, hospital records, and photographs that would challenge everything Ali thought he knew about his identity. But before she revealed them, Margaret Sullivan looked directly into his eyes and asked a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Muhammad, are you prepared to learn that the people you've called your parents your entire life might not be your biological parents? Are you ready to discover that your real mother has been searching for you since the day you were born?" The weight of her words settled over the small hotel room like a heavy blanket. Ali, the man who had proclaimed himself the greatest, who had faced down the United States government and sacrificed years of his career for his principles, found himself speechless. The truth he had unconsciously been seeking his entire life was finally within reach, but the cost of that knowledge was becoming terrifyingly clear. Margaret Sullivan opened the envelope and began to spread its contents across the small table. Each document she revealed seemed to chip away at the foundation of Ali's understanding of himself, his family, and his place in the world. The afternoon sun, streaming through the hotel room window, illuminated papers that would forever change the life of the most famous athlete in the world. The first document Margaret Sullivan placed on the table was a birth certificate, but not the one Ali had seen before. This one was different, older, more detailed, and bearing information that made his breath catch in his throat. According to this certificate, the baby born on January 17, 1942, had been listed as Baby Boy Sullivan before being transferred to the care of Cassius and Odessa Clay just 3 days later. Margaret's voice was steady but filled with emotion as she explained what had happened over 3 decades earlier. She had been 17 years old, unmarried, and from a prominent white family in Louisville whose reputation meant everything to them. When she became pregnant by a young black man she had fallen in love with, her family faced a scandal that could have destroyed their social standing in the segregated South. Ali stared at the documents, his mind struggling to process the implications. The woman sitting across from him, with her silver hair and blue eyes, was claiming to be his biological mother. The love story she began to unfold was one of forbidden romance in a time and place where such relationships could mean death for the man and complete social exile for the woman. Margaret's voice grew softer as she spoke about James Washington, Ali's biological father. He had been a young laborer, intelligent and ambitious, despite the limited opportunities available to black men in 1940s Kentucky. They had met at a church social event where Margaret had been volunteering, defying her family's expectations by working with the local black community on literacy programs. Their relationship had developed in secret, conducted through stolen moments and clandestine meetings in places where a white woman and black man could interact without arousing suspicion. James had dreams of moving north, of finding opportunities that didn't exist in the segregated South. Margaret had dreams of a world where love could transcend the artificial barriers of race and social class. But when Margaret discovered she was pregnant, both their worlds collapsed. Her family, upon learning of her condition, immediately made arrangements to send her away to a distant relative's home where she could give birth in secret. The plan was simple and brutal. The baby would be given up for adoption, Margaret would return home as if nothing had happened, and James Washington would be paid to leave Louisville forever and never return. Ali listened in stunned silence as Margaret described the months of her pregnancy, hidden away in a small town outside Louisville, forbidden from contacting James or anyone from her previous life. She had spent those months reading everything she could find about child development and boxing, having learned that James had been an amateur fighter before work and family responsibilities ended his ring career. The birth had been difficult, taking place in a small clinic with minimal medical facilities. But when Margaret held her son for the first time, she knew she couldn't simply give him away to strangers. Working with a sympathetic nurse who understood the impossible situation, she had arranged for the baby to be placed with Cassius and Odessa Clay, a young couple who had been trying to have children for years. The arrangement had been carefully orchestrated to appear legitimate. The Clays believed they were adopting a baby whose teenage mother couldn't care for him. They were told the father was unknown, a common story in those days. What they didn't know was that Margaret had specifically chosen them after weeks of careful observation, watching how they interacted with children in their neighborhood, seeing the love and stability they could provide. Margaret reached into the envelope again and pulled out a series of photographs that took Ali's breath away. The first showed a young black man in boxing gloves, his stance and build remarkably similar to Ali's own. This was James Washington, and the resemblance was unmistakable. The same height, the same broad shoulders, the same confident expression that had become Ali's trademark. But it was the next photograph that truly shook him. It showed Margaret as a young woman, holding a newborn baby, her face radiant with love and heartbreak. The baby in her arms had the same distinctive features that would later make Muhammad Ali one of the most recognizable faces in the world. The photograph had been taken secretly by the sympathetic nurse, a violation of the strict rules that governed such adoptions. Angelo, who had remained silent throughout Margaret's revelation, finally spoke. His voice was hoarse with emotion as he asked the question that was burning in everyone's mind. Why now? Why are you telling him this after all these years? Margaret's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her face as she explained the urgency that had driven her to seek out Ali after decades of silence. James Washington had died 6 months earlier in Detroit, where he had built a successful life as a factory supervisor and community leader. On his deathbed, he had made Margaret promise to find their son and tell him the truth about his origins. She had spent months tracking down Ali's whereabouts, following his career not just as a fan, but as a mother watching her son achieve greatness from a distance. She had been in the audience, unrecognized, at several of his fights, her heart swelling with pride and breaking with the knowledge that she could never publicly claim him as her own. The revelation that James Washington had followed Ali's career from afar added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. Margaret showed them newspaper clippings that James had collected over the years, articles about Ali's amateur career, his Olympic gold medal, his professional victories, and even his controversial stands on Vietnam and civil rights. In the margins of these articles, James had written notes, observations about Ali's fighting style, pride in his achievements, and speculation about whether their son had inherited his father's quick hands and strategic mind. Ali finally found his voice, asking the question that had been building inside him since Margaret began her story. Did he know? Did James Washington know that I was his son? Margaret nodded, fresh tears flowing as she explained that James had figured it out years earlier when Ali's career began making national headlines. The resemblance was too strong, the timing too perfect, and James had connections in Louisville who could confirm his suspicions. But he had respected the agreement made decades earlier, understanding that revealing the truth could destroy the family that had raised Ali with such love and dedication. The weight of this knowledge was staggering. Ali realized that somewhere in Detroit, a man who was his biological father had been watching his career, celebrating his victories, and suffering through his defeats, all while maintaining a silence that must have been agonizing. James Washington had died, knowing that his son had become the most famous athlete in the world, but never having the chance to embrace him or tell him how proud he was. Margaret reached into the envelope one final time and pulled out a letter, written in James Washington's careful handwriting. It was addressed to "My son, Muhammad Ali," and dated just weeks before his death. With trembling hands, she passed it to Ali, explaining that James had written it, hoping that someday, somehow, it would reach him. Ali opened the letter with reverent care, his eyes scanning the words that his biological father had written from his hospital bed. The letter was a masterpiece of love, regret, and pride, written by a man who had spent decades watching his son from afar. James wrote about the dreams he had harbored for their reunion, the conversations he had imagined having, and the overwhelming pride he felt watching Ali stand up for his principles even when it cost him everything. The letter also contained practical information that helped fill in the gaps of Ali's understanding about himself. James explained that the quick hands and strategic thinking that had made Ali such a formidable boxer were inherited traits, passed down through a family line of fighters and thinkers who had used their intelligence and physical gifts to survive and thrive despite the limitations placed on them by society. But perhaps most importantly, the letter contained an explanation for some of the personality traits that had always set Ali apart. His willingness to speak truth to power, his refusal to accept limitations placed on him by others, and his deep sense of justice were all characteristics that James recognized from his own family history. Ali's famous declaration that he was pretty wasn't just youthful boasting. It was an inherited confidence that had been passed down through generations of people who had refused to internalize the negative messages society tried to impose on them. As Ali finished reading the letter, the small hotel room fell into profound silence. The three people present were each processing the magnitude of what had been revealed, understanding that this moment would forever divide Ali's life into before and after. The man who had always proclaimed himself the greatest was discovering that his greatness had roots he had never known existed. Margaret broke the silence by explaining that she had one more gift for Ali, information about extended family members who were still alive and had been following his career with the same mixture of pride and secrecy that had characterized James Washington's vigil. There were aunts and uncles, cousins and family friends who had watched Ali's rise to fame while carrying the burden of knowledge they could never share. The revelation that he had an entire extended family who had been silently supporting him from afar was almost too much for Ali to process. He thought about all the times he had felt alone in his battles against the boxing establishment, the government, and the media. The knowledge that there had been people out there who shared his blood and his struggles, who understood his defiance because it was part of their family heritage, was both comforting and heartbreaking. Angelo, ever the practical manager, began asking questions about verification and documentation, but Ali stopped him with a gesture, understanding instinctively that the truth Margaret Sullivan had shared was beyond doubt. The resemblance to James Washington, the timeline of events, and most importantly, the way this revelation explained so many mysteries about his own personality and abilities, all confirmed what his heart had already accepted. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret shared more stories about James Washington's life after leaving Louisville. He had indeed moved north, eventually settling in Detroit, where he had found work in the automotive industry. He had married a woman who knew about his past and had supported his decision to honor the agreement that kept him separated from his son. They had raised 2 daughters together, Ali's half-sisters, who had grown up knowing they had a famous brother they could never publicly acknowledge. The complexity of the situation was staggering. Ali realized that he had siblings he had never met, a stepmother who had helped raise children while knowing about the son who had been given away, and an entire community of people who had been invested in his success from the very beginning of his career. The support system he had always believed was limited to his adoptive family, his trainers, and his friends was actually much larger and more complex than he had ever imagined. Margaret explained that James Washington's widow, Sarah, was still alive and living in Detroit. She had been the one who encouraged Margaret to finally reach out to Ali after James's death, understanding that the secret had become too heavy for any one person to carry alone. Sarah had followed Ali's career as closely as James had, attending his fights when they were broadcast on television and keeping scrapbooks of newspaper articles about his achievements. The thought of meeting Sarah Washington, the woman who had shared his biological father's life and helped him maintain his silent vigil over Ali's career, was both exciting and terrifying. Ali realized that this revelation was just the beginning of a journey that would reshape his understanding of himself and his place in the world. As the sun began to set over Chicago, casting long shadows across the hotel room, Margaret Sullivan gathered her documents and photographs, understanding that Ali needed time to process everything he had learned. She gave him contact information for Sarah Washington and other family members, along with copies of all the documents she had shared. Before leaving, Margaret did something that surprised everyone in the room. She approached Ali and, with tears in her eyes, asked if she could hug him. For a moment, the heavyweight champion of the world became simply a son, embracing his mother for the first time in over 30 years. The embrace was brief but profound, carrying the weight of decades of separation and the hope of possible reconciliation. After Margaret left, Ali and Angelo sat in the hotel room as darkness fell over the city. The documents and photographs were spread across the table like pieces of a puzzle that had finally been assembled, revealing a picture that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Ali understood that his life had just changed in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. The man who had always been supremely confident in his identity now faced the challenge of integrating this new knowledge into his understanding of himself. He was still Muhammad Ali, still the heavyweight champion, still the man who had stood up to the government and sacrificed years of his career for his principles. But now he was also the son of James Washington and Margaret Sullivan, part of a love story that had transcended the racial barriers of the segregated South and produced a child who would change the world. As they prepared to leave the hotel, Ali realized that he had a choice to make. He could keep this information private, protecting the families who had raised him and loved him, or he could find a way to honor both his adoptive parents and his biological parents, while maintaining the relationships that had sustained him throughout his life. The decision would require the same courage and wisdom that had guided him through the most challenging moments of his career. The drive back through Chicago's nighttime streets was quiet, both men lost in their own thoughts about the implications of what they had learned. Ali stared out at the city lights, understanding that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to demonstrate the greatness that had been passed down to him through bloodlines he was only now beginning to understand. Hey, my friends, help me by subscribing to the channel so we can reach 1,000 subscribers, even if you're watching from your TV or computer. Your subscription makes all the difference, and the algorithm will help you see more amazing stories. Leave a like or an emoji in the comments and be part of this growth.